Good morning, everyone, and welcome once again to the 10 Years Hence lecture series. Typically, Professor Jim O'Rourke is here. I'm filling in for him. I'm Jeff Bergstrand, the Associate Dean for Graduate Programs. Before I have the honor of introducing our guest today, I do want to make one little announcement, and some of you may have heard about it. It was released this morning. As you know, the undergraduate business program here in Mendoza is ranked every year by Business Week, Bloomberg Business Week, and the rankings just came out. Many of you may know that we've been number one for the last 4 years. Well, it turns out today we continue to be number one. All right. So this is the fifth consecutive year. We're very proud of it. We're very grateful to the wonderful students that we have to teach in this program, and also the staff and faculty that contribute to it. We also understand that next year they're going to change the methodology for the rankings. So we may not stay in there next year. We'll see how things turn out, but we're very proud of that. I'd like to introduce our guest this morning, who is Dr. Shibley Telhami. He is the Anwar Sadat Professor for Peace and Development at the University of Maryland, also a non-resident senior fellow at the Saban Center of the Brookings Institution. Before coming to the University of Maryland, he has taught at several universities, including all prestigious Cornell, Ohio State, Southern California, Princeton, Columbia, Swarthmore, and the University of California at Berkeley, where he received his doctorate in political science. Professor Telhami has also been very active in the foreign policy arena, as well as being a noted scholar. He has served as advisor to the U.S. mission to the United Nations, advisor to former Congressman Lee Hamilton, more recently senior advisor to George Mitchell, President Obama's U.S. Special Envoy for Middle East Peace, and as a member of the U.S. delegation to the Trilateral U.S.-Israeli-Palestinian Anti-Incitement Committee. He's also served as advisor to the U.S. Department of State. He served on the Iraq Study Group as a member of the Strategic Environment Working Group. He served on the U.S. Advisory Group on Public Policy for the Arab and Muslim World, which was appointed by the Department of State at the request of Congress. And he co-drafted the report of their findings, Changing Minds, Winning Peace. He's also co-drafted several Council on Foreign Relations reports on U.S. public policy, on the Arab-Israeli peace process, and on Persian Gulf security. He's also written dozens of books about diplomacy and foreign relations, including his latest, The World Through Arab Eyes, Arab Public Opinion, and the Reshaping of the Middle East. He's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and serves on numerous civic, academic, and not-for-profit boards. Professor Telhami was selected by the Carnegie Corporation of New York with the New York Times as one of the great immigrants for 2013. So please help me welcome to Notre Dame Dr. Shibley Telhami.
Thanks so much. Thanks for hosting me, and it's really a pleasure for me to be here. First of all, congratulations on that new ranking. I know that it doesn't only reflect on the business school; it reflects on the university overall. This is an outstanding institution that I've admired over the years. So much so that, in fact, in many ways, for me personally, this is like a 40th anniversary of my first visit to Notre Dame. I came here almost exactly 40 years ago. I was still an undergraduate student in mathematics, pursuing at the time a PhD in mathematics, and I was accepted to Notre Dame before I changed my mind and decided to study philosophy, later political science. But I came here, I had a lovely experience, stayed overnight with a student, and even then got to meet a great American treasure, Father Hesburgh, whom I'm having the pleasure of meeting with again this afternoon. So I've been there many times since, of course, and I very much admire this institution. Let me tell you a little bit about my presentation up front because I want to put it in some perspective. It'll be I will only cover a certain set of issues in this presentation, but I invite questions that you may have on anything related to American policy in the Middle East that I'm not covering in the presentation, obviously by virtue of this being relatively short. I'm not going to cover many issues that might be on your mind, including what's happening in Egypt and Syria and the Arab-Israeli conflict, the Palestinian-Israeli negotiations that are sort of seem to be unraveling, what's happening in the policy toward Iran. All these issues I'm actually following very closely, both in terms of writing about, talking to officials about, in some cases visiting the region on. I go there frequently and have a sense. So I invite questions about these broader subjects in the exchange, even if they're not formally in the presentation. But I want to focus my presentation on the theme, the world through Arab eyes, Arab public opinion, and the reshaping of the Middle East, which is a theme of my new book. And I want to tell you sort of what drove me to embark on what really is over a 20-year journey to study this subject. And I know that many of you, like everyone else around the world, focused on the Middle East a lot in the past few years, particularly after the major uprisings in Tunisia and Egypt, especially Egypt, the Tahrir Square example of millions of people going into the streets to overthrow dictators across the region. And obviously since then, things haven't gone exactly like people had hoped, but nonetheless, it's become a place where people ask the question, what do people want? Well, suddenly people discovered that publics matter, that people actually matter, because we had all these people who were dismissed in the past going in and seemingly in a very brief period, as happened in Egypt and Tunisia, overthrow long-entrenched authoritarian rulers. And yet, what got me interested in the first place in this project was not so much those uprisings. It's what preceded these uprisings, because for years I have noticed how our discourse in the West, how our analysts, how our policymakers have been dismissive of public opinion in the region. And the notion behind it was that, essentially you have rulers who are not elected, who have power, who can bypass the public, so why should we pay attention to public opinion? Let me give you two examples, in fact, specifically, from an era that really started me thinking about this role of public opinion. My first book was actually about the Egyptian-Israeli negotiations in the late 70s that led to what we call the Camp David Accords, the peace treaty between Egypt and Israel. This was a profoundly important event in Middle East history, one that the U.S. played a central role in, particularly with President Jimmy Carter having mediated that agreement. In fact, today when people look at President Carter's legacy as president, this is a highlight of his administration from that period. And when I started writing that book, I came across the actual debates that were taking place at Camp David, Maryland, that led to the actual agreement. Jimmy Carter, the president, brought the president of Egypt at the time, Anwar Sadat, and the prime minister of Israel, Menachem Begin, to Camp David, Maryland in 1978 to force them to come together to break this impasse in their relations, to break years of war and to forge a peace treaty that would be comprehensive. When he brought them together on the first day, he wanted to just have an initial conversation with them. And as you might imagine, they're meeting at Camp David. The first thing they will do is each side is going to lay out its conditions for negotiations, as you might expect. But one thing happened, and that is when Menachem Begin, the prime minister of Israel, told Sadat that he should make the following compromises, A, B, C, D, Anwar Sadat, the president of Egypt, turned to him and said, you know, what you asked me is political suicide. I can't. My public will not accept this. There's no way I can get my public to accept this. So Menachem Begin turned to him and said, what do you mean you're public? Essentially, he called him a dictator. He didn't quite use that term. He said, basically, public opinion doesn't matter. You control it. You tell them what to believe. You control public opinion. In any case, you can overcome it. You can do independently from your public opinion. Who cares? Well, interestingly, just over the past few weeks, the CIA declassified documents from that period. Documents I reviewed. We did a segment on National Public Radio on these declassified documents. And one document was actually from that same period when the president of Egypt, Anwar Sadat, undertook his initiative to break the deadlock and wage peace with Israel. Of course, the U.S. administration asked the CIA to analyze whether, in fact, the public in Egypt is likely to support him. Does he have internal, or at least internally, does he have much support? Will he have much support? And the document went roughly like this. I'm not giving it verbatim, but very close. It said, well, does he have the support of military institutions? Yes, he probably does. Does he have the support of the bureaucracies? Yes, he probably has. Does he have the support of the elites? Yes, he probably has. What about the public? And so they then estimated that Egypt at the time had 35 million people. Now, by the way, Egypt has 85 million people. So about 35 million people. And then they said between the Upper Egypt, the Delta of the Nile, the poor in the cities, that's 32 million people. So they counted 32 million people in these groups. And they said basically, they don't matter. You don't have to pay attention to them. They don't matter for policy. So essentially ignore them. And that was essentially the wisdom at that time. And not just at that time, I would say through even the following a couple of decades and more, that you can ignore them. Well, at some level, of course, they were justified because rulers, played a major role in shaping public opinion. In many cases at that time, they basically controlled the media completely. It was government-controlled media. They told the public the story, the narrative they wanted the public to hear. But more importantly, for sure the public didn't have a direct line into policymaking. These people were not elected. They can ignore the public. They can do what they want. So there was some truth to it. But here's the thing. In almost all the episodes that I've studied, even during this period in the Middle East, whether it's Egypt or Jordan or any other country, in every place that I studied, rulers behaved as though public opinion matters. They were all frightened or concerned about public opinion. And you might ask why that might be the case. Let's go back to the Egypt case, Anwar Sadat. In the case of the Egyptian president, he ultimately did sign a peace treaty with Israel. And he did not give in to every demand that the Israelis did. It was a compromise agreement, as you might expect. And what happened? He was assassinated. And what happened in addition to that? This is the period during which you had the rise of the Egyptian militancy that gave rise to Ayman Zawahiri, who is now the head of Al-Qaeda. So you can say public opinion doesn't matter at some level where, they're not voting, but you can't say it's not consequential. And so from that point on, I said to myself, I need to study public opinion. I need to know what the public thinks and how it influences policy and why rulers try to understand what the public wants, even when they can go against them. Why is it that they're worried about the public opinion? And as I was starting to write this, particularly after the 1991 Iraq War, we had a sudden explosion in the information revolution. It started with satellite television. I know the shorthand for you is Al Jazeera, which was launched in 1996. Al Jazeera, of course, dominates quite a bit of the media market in the Middle East, but it represented a real, genuine information revolution in the fact that you had suddenly television stations that could broadcast across state boundaries and that rulers simply couldn't ignore them. And so, to give you an example of what happened in a decade from that period all the way until 2010, the rise of the Arab uprisings, when you ask people in 1995 or 1990, what is your main source of news? What is your main source of news? Whether it was in Egypt or Morocco or Jordan or anywhere else, they will invariably give you a source that was within their own boundaries. Egyptian news for Egyptians, Moroccan news for Moroccans, and mostly stations that are controlled by their own governments. By 2010, in my polls that I conducted, when you ask the question, in all of the countries where I did polling, and I'll give you the countries in a minute, you ask them, what is your main source of news? In every country, a majority cites a source of news from outside of their own boundaries. And so in 15 years, governments completely lost control over the narrative. And so it meant that public opinion was not only important, but now had its own source of information that governments couldn't directly manipulate as much. Obviously, government continue to do so, will continue to do so, but not as much. And when that started, I stipulated, as a scholar interested in this area, that we really need to understand the impact of this information revolution on politics and public opinion, how it's going to change politics and society across in the long term. And in order to do that, I thought we needed to do empirical studies. We needed to have some sense of A, what people are watching, and B, how that is influencing not only their opinions on core issues, but how they define themselves, who they are, their collective identity. Is that also changing as a consequence of this information revolution? So I set out to have 10 years of public opinion polling in 6 countries. Egypt, the most populous country. Saudi Arabia, the richest Arab country. Morocco in North Africa. Jordan, close to the Arab-Israeli core. Lebanon, another country that has ethnic diversity. And the United Arab Emirates. So we had 6 countries to study year after year to understand how media habits are changing over time and whether that has a direct impact not only on opinion, but also on changing notions of identity. And so what I'm going to present to you now is basically give you just 3 central points that come out of that research, answering essentially 3 questions. Although in the book that I've just published, there are multiple themes that obviously I'm not going to cover today, but I'm going to focus on some analytical points that I want to make. So the 3 points I'd like to make now are, number 1 is that what I want to trace is how identity in the Arab world has changed in that period. And number 2, I want to make the case that contrary to a lot of assumptions that foreign policy had nothing to do with the Arab uprisings, I want to show you that it had a lot to do with the uprisings, even though it was also about food and jobs. And number 3, I want to give you my thoughts on what to expect in the coming years, particularly given this huge diversity of cases from Egypt to Libya to Syria to Bahrain to Tunisia that are very different. What do they have in common and what's different and what are we to expect in the coming years? So let me start with the first question about identities. I think understanding the issue of identity is central. Why is it central? You know, for me as a scholar who does public opinion polls, not only in the Arab world, but also here and in Israel, I do it in all these places. What is interesting to me is not so much what the public thinks at any given time. I mean, that's interesting for if you're interested in the elections. You want to know who they're going to vote for. It's interesting to look at some shifts that may take place over a particular period. If you're in consumer business, you obviously want to know what tastes are like and so forth. So it's informative. It can give you some idea that is itself interesting. But that's not the most interesting intellectual question. That's not the most interesting intellectual questions. I'm less interested in the answers that I hear in my polls than I am in the frame of reference that people employ that lead them to give the answer they give. Because I know when I ask a question, it could be different in 6 months. So what I'm trying to understand isn't just the answer they're giving. I am trying to understand the prism through which they look when they present an answer. And I think one main issue that explains that prism and that explains that frame of reference is notions of core identity. Because particularly on issues that I study in this volume that have to do with war and peace and attitudes toward the rest of the world and social issues like the role of women and the role of religion and attitudes toward non-Arab countries in the region like Iran and Turkey, all of them are connected to certain notions of identity or core identity that people hold. And so one of the tests that I have done throughout that period is directly connected to the evolution of identity. How are people changing? How is their sense of self changing? Assuming they're all complex, as we are all complex. I mean, we are all, as I say, multiple selves, because there are aspects of each one of us that matter more at any given time. We don't always place the same weight on the same aspect of our identity. And it shifts depending on context and time and history. And so for Arabs politically, we present basically 4 choices. One is Arab, one is Muslim or Christian, because there are obviously a proportion of the Arab population of Christian, particularly in Egypt and Lebanon. Their identification with the state, whether they're Egyptian, Jordanian, or Saudi, and citizen of the world, what we call cosmopolitan individuals. So, of course, any person can be all these things at the same time. The question for us, and we grant them that up front, we say the question is, which one is more important to you today? And through that, we have a way of measuring what is the trend and then connecting it to some variables that give us some insight into the explanation. So let me first of all give you what the findings are, and then I'm going to present you with some suggestions of what drives it. One finding is, actually before I talk about the finding, I should say that as you might expect, while we have a trend across the board, and aggregately you can summarize the findings, it should be noted and highlighted that Arab states and Arab peoples are different from country to country. They have a lot in common, but they also have a lot of differences. And so, for example, if you look at just the countries that I have that I poll in Saudi Arabia, it is that's the place where the people are less likely to say they are Saudi first. In fact, in some years, less than 20% of the population said they're Saudi first. And they're mostly Muslim first, second Arab, and then third Saudi. In Lebanon, a fragmented country, across every sect, most people say they're Lebanese first. They identify with the state first. In Egypt, it's the most balanced identity. You have roughly one-third, one-third, one-third with some variations, Arab, Muslim, and Muslim/Christian, and Egyptian. So you have those identities certainly vary. But overall, here's the trend, which has been interesting. A decline in affinity with the state. People were less likely to identify with the state. And an increase in the number of people who identify with Islam. And Arab remained relatively robust throughout the whole period. So essentially, transnational identity increased at the expense of the state. And I want to give you just a quick interpretation of that. I welcome questions on it because it's complex, but I want to give you just two main thoughts that are central here. One thought is the information revolution. Remember what I said, that the information revolution had a remarkable impact? Well, because satellite television that dominated through much of that decade, even before the rise of the internet in the past 5 years, that inevitably enhances transnational identity, that is, Arab or Muslim. Why? Because if you are Al Jazeera TV, just to take one example, broadcasting out of Qatar, your audience isn't the Qatari or the Saudi or the Egyptian. Your audience is the prototype Arab or prototype Muslim. Why? Because your market, thinking in a business language, your market is no longer the limited citizens of your country. It is now everyone who can speak Arabic, and that is 350 million people. And they're mostly Muslim. And so what you're trying to do is reach the broadest possible market. So even from a marketing point of view, what product would you put on the table for that market? Your best chance of reaching the widest possible market is put a product on the table that is more in common to the rest of the population. And so you highlight issues that are in common to Arabs and Muslims overall. So transnational identity in part increased because of the rise of transnational media. That's number one. Number two, the fact that state identification declined is not just related to that, but we know that states haven't done well. That identity is preceded by a set of aspirations. People are trying to get some things through these identities. And the state hasn't provided. So we know that state failure has been, a theme in the literature. That's not a surprise. That people are frustrated that they were not providing, whether it's jobs or education or certainly freedom. So the fact that states don't do well is not a surprise. And that's tied to that is something interesting, because in places like Libya, where we have, to say you are a Libyan 5 years ago was to say, that you like Gaddafi. Why? Because he's the only ruler you've ever known. He came to power in 1969. The overwhelming majority of the population was born after he came to power. And so when they don't like Gaddafi, they don't like the state. The state and the ruler are one and the same. It's not here we can dislike a president, whether it's Bush or Obama, and we still feel American. And we know they're not going to stay. And we know that we have a say in selecting them. So first, anger with these rulers who've been there for a long time also undermine affinity with the state. But then the question is, why do you have the rise of Islamic identity more than Arab identity through that period? And I'm going to give you an answer because I think it's important to understand. I think there's a misunderstanding, particularly because the Arab uprisings followed a decade of hostility after 9/11. And then you had Islamic groups do well politically in places like Libya, Egypt, Tunisia, and elsewhere, that people thought there's an ideological embrace of political Islam that is dominant in the Arab world, and I don't agree with that. In fact, that's not what we see in the polling, and I'll give you a couple of examples that leads me to believe that. First, we know it's not, while people in the Middle East are religious, they have been for a long time, they still are. So when you ask people whether they're Christian or Muslim in Egypt, whether they're religious, the overwhelming majority say yes. And that has been the case throughout. This is not new. You have over 99% almost of the Egyptian population say in some ways that they're religious. And yet, this has been kind of a standard thing. It's not something that suddenly spikes. So it's not about belief. It's about whether or not that leads them to embrace political Islam and certainly militant political Islam. And what we find in the poll is not the case. For example, over the decade, when we were focused on Al-Qaeda and the horror that obviously it conducted on our own soil, we confused the anger with American foreign policy to be embrace of Al-Qaeda, which was not the case. And in the polling, for example, when we asked what aspect of Al-Qaeda, if any, do you find do you admire most, we found that less than 10% admire them for their ideology of having a Taliban-like state. In some cases, less than 6%. And in some cases less than 4%, depending on the year. And most basically said, of course, they don't admire any aspect of them, but those who did said the fact that they're standing up to the U.S. or the fact that they were speaking for causes they believed in, such as Palestine or the presence of American forces in the Gulf. So it was about issues, it wasn't an embrace of the political ideology. And even in Egypt, after the Arab Uprisings in the spring of 2012, I conducted a poll on the eve of the Egyptian elections, asking people whether they wanted to see Islamic religious law, the Sharia law, as a basis of the new constitution. We had 2/3 say yes, which is not uncommon, by the way, in the Middle East. Actually, even under Mubarak in Egypt, Sharia law was a basis of the constitution in Egypt, so that's not new. But when you ask them, do you want Sharia law to be implemented literally, including to penal law, or do you want it adapted to modern times, we had over 80% say adapted to modern times. So this was not an embrace of extremist ideology from the beginning. It never was. And I would suggest there was something else. And that is that my own theory about identity selection is that of all the aspects of our identity, our embrace of one aspect over the others is driven by two things on two ends of the spectrum. One is that we embrace that aspect of identity that seems most conducive to our aspirations. So we ask, what's the winning strategy? So you bandwagon on what seems to be winning. On the other end, we are what we have to defend. So whatever aspect of our identity seems most under assault, we rally behind it. So I'll give you an example. Why is Barack Obama black? Why is he an African-American man? I mean, we take it for granted. Well, if we called him a white man, I think we'd be scratching our heads. Well, in part, it's how he identifies himself. But you are what you have to defend. And I could tell you, for example, I was an analyst and a commentator. I'm often a critic of American foreign policy because we do a lot of things wrong. We do some things right, but we do some things wrong. And my aim as a public policy analyst to be critical, to show how we could improve. But when I'm somewhere else, like in Europe or the Middle East, and everyone is ganging up on America, I find myself defending. because I defend that aspect of the self that's most under assault. And if you look at the polling throughout that decade, it's clear that most Muslims over that decade felt that Islam itself was under assault. They felt that American foreign policy in the post-9/11, that the war on terrorism was a war on Islam. And I do believe that that does generate more highlighting of their notion of identity. Now, I want to transition from that to make a second point, which is that contrary to a lot of analysis of the Arab uprisings, foreign policy has been central to the uprisings in ways that are invisible. But you can't understand these uprisings without understanding Arab anger on foreign policy issues. You cannot do that. Now, let me just say a couple of introductory points so I'm not misunderstood. The Arab uprisings are over a lot of things. People were angry with the regimes. They were angry with the regimes because they didn't have freedom. They were angry with regimes because they didn't have good jobs. They were angry with regimes because they didn't have food in some cases. Of course, they were angry with these. But, if you look at the whole series of the decades that preceded the Arab uprisings, there was nothing that you could say in the previous decade that you had some tremendously new economic crisis or job crisis or freedom crisis that generated different kind of reaction from previous decades. There was nothing that you can point to with that regard. And it is true, I think, that when Arabs went to the street, the driving force for the public, and certainly those who were behind the uprisings, is exactly what they chanted in the streets of Cairo and Tunisia and elsewhere, and that is dignity, the pursuit of dignity and freedom. But I'm going to argue to you that that dignity that they sought cannot be understood simply in the relationship with their rulers, but also in the relationship between their nations and the outside world. And the two were tied together. That their anger with the rulers wasn't only about the absence of freedom, but because their rulers seemed to be subcontractors of foreign powers over issues that went directly against their sense of dignity. And that you cannot split those two. They're tied together. And I'll give you examples to prove it. The first one I'll start with is the question of identity. Now, the question of identity I already talked about, but let's break it down a little bit more. Let's figure out what it really means when someone says, I'm a Muslim first or I'm an Arab first, over being an Egyptian first or a Jordanian first. Now, granted that when somebody says I'm a Muslim first or Arab first, we don't know exactly what they mean, whether it's a cultural identity, a political identity, a religious identity. We don't know that for sure. It could be, and it's going to vary from context to context. People give different answers in different contexts. But here's one thing that is a common thread when you're asserting that identity. And that is, you are saying, I care about other Arabs and Muslims. You're connecting yourself to people outside your own boundaries. If you're an Egyptian, you're connecting yourself to Jordanians and Palestinians and Saudis and Moroccans. And in some cases, if you're asserting you're Muslim, you're connecting yourself even to people like Iranians and Turks and Malaysians and Indonesians who are not Arab. So that does mean immediately that you care about what happens outside your own boundaries, just by virtue of asserting that identity. But we do another test of that, which is very telling. And that is, we ask a question that is directly on that. Do you believe that the role of government is to serve the interests of its citizens or the interests of Arabs or the interests of Muslims more broadly? Now, the role of government is different from identity. That's a very functional thing, right? And we think as American citizens who elect our government, the role of government is to serve us as citizens. We even say, no taxation, no representation. We're paying a price. We're expecting the services. We have that bargain. This is our understanding of the role of government. In my polling in the Arab world, more than half say the job of the government is to serve not only its citizens, but also the interests of Arabs and Muslims outside their own boundaries. That puts foreign policy at center stage. Second point I want to make. If you look at the decade that preceded the Uprisings 2010, and you were to ask the question, what galvanized public opinion more than any other issue during that decade, you'd have to say it's foreign policy issues. In fact, foreign policy is what made Al Jazeera what it became in that decade. Why? Because that decade was a decade of war and destruction and anger and humiliation for the Arabs. That started with the collapse of the Israeli-Palestinian negotiations at the beginning of that decade in 2000. That led to the Palestinian Intifada, the uprising that was bloody and very tough Israeli measures in the West Bank and Gaza. Bloody period that galvanized public opinion. That was the big story in the Arab media for a long period of time that preceded 9/11 and followed 9/11. And then, of course, we had our own tragedy, 9/11, that created a whole new set of relations and policies with the region. And not only starting the war in Afghanistan, a Muslim country, but Iraq particularly. And on the Iraq war, 90% of the Arab people opposed it and believed it went against their core interests. And yet the governments ultimately not only acquiesced in it, in some cases cooperated with the U.S. implementation of that war. And then in 2006, there was the Lebanese-Israeli war. And in 2008, 2009, there was the Israeli-Gaza war. All the way until Barack Obama came to office. So it was a decade of mostly foreign policy issues, principally war and bloodshed, over which Arabs felt very angry, not only with the international system that they felt was not doing them justice, but also with the rulers that they thought were essentially subcontractors, particularly with the U.S. And so that's what galvanized that whole decade. But here's the third point I want to make, which is connected to it, again, in terms of evidence. One question I ask in my polling is, whom among world leaders do you admire most outside your own countries? Now, remember, I say outside your own countries because I don't want to put them in a position to evaluate their kings and presidents. I take that out of the game. So I want to ask you to think here for a minute that when I'm asking a question like this, whom among world leaders do you admire most, I am asking not really because I care about who they're going to mention. Because as I said, they're going to say one person today and next year is going to be someone else. It's not a popularity issue. I'm not trying to see who's popular and who's not. I am trying to do what I told you up front. I am trying to figure out what is the prism through which they look when they give me an answer. What is the framework of reference that leads them to give a particular answer? So I'm going to give you a selection of the answers that they gave throughout that whole period and just make you think about, so what is the framework that they're employing when they give me that answer? Let's start with that period following 9/11, particularly leading up to the Iraq War and early Iraq War. This is a period, if you recall, I know some of you are too young to recall it really in person, but if you recall having read about it, I hope anyway, that we were talking about the clash of civilization between the Western world and Islam. That was the dominant theme, particularly in the counterterrorism strategy that emerged after 9/11. And so we're focused on, quote, they hate us for our values, they hate us for our freedom, which is words uttered by then President Bush, but to be fair to him, he was referring mostly to the terrorists and Al-Qaeda, but many took to mean the broader Muslim world. And so right in the middle of that, when people are angry on the Iraq War, they're angry with the U.S. Mounting the Iraq War, they've already been angry with the Afghanistan War, and I ask in my polls, whom among world leaders do you admire most? In 6 Arab countries, mostly Sunni countries. And people are expecting to hear some Islamic leader, ruler, or some authority along this line. The number one answer was Jacques Chirac, the president of France. Now think about that for a minute. I mean, not only is he a leader of a Western country, but think about which Western country, France, a country I love, by the way. I mean, any of you who've been to France, it's hard not to love France. But let's face it, a country with bloody colonial history in Arab and Muslim countries. A country that has had a crisis with immigrants from the Arab world. A country that has had a problem with Muslim women wearing veils in public schools. And those all were part of the debate. And so here is the public embracing a right-wing French president, Jacques Chirac, as the most admired man in the Arab world. And that included Saudis in Saudi Arabia, that we generally think is the house of this place where people are going to think from a clash of civilization point of view. And it's certainly true of Egypt and Jordan. Before I give you the answer to it, I want to fast forward to the person who replaced Jacques Chirac on that list. And it was 2006, 2007, really, I think, through 2008. Now, that's the period, by the way, when if you look at the discourse here about the Middle East, the clash of civilizations thesis had been replaced by a new thesis that came out of the Iraq War. With all the bloodshed in Iraq, people discovered that there's sectarianism, mostly Sunni Shia sectarianism. And that period is full of new literature about the new division in the Arab world, in the Middle East broadly, and that is the Sunni Shia division that replaces even confrontation with the West and even with Israel. And so here I am pulling mostly in Sunni Muslim countries, in Egypt and Morocco and Saudi Arabia, for example. And I'm asking them, whom among world leaders do you admire most? And they name Hassan Nasrallah, the Shia cleric leader of Hezbollah in Lebanon. And this is Sunni countries, in the middle of talking about Sunni-Shia divide. Fast forward another couple of years, 2010, 2011, I asked them, whom among world leaders do you admire most? And they name Hugo Chavez of Venezuela. Now, you know, first of all, it's easy to see that no single ruler from the Middle East is on that list. And by the way, no single ruler was number 2 or 3 on that list. Period. You see that though no Sunni leader of any kind was that on that list, and it wasn't even number 2 or number 3 up until 2011, where the Prime Minister of Turkey emerged as an admired ruler. So what explains this selection? What is the framework that they're employing here that can explain this unusual combination of people, Jacques Chirac, Hassan Nasrallah, and Hugo Chavez? Well, very straightforward. Very straightforward. They're looking through a very narrow prism of their anger with American foreign policy and their anger with Israel. And if you look at Chirac at that time, they saw him as the man who said no to George W. Bush at the UN on the Iraq War, and the man who hosted Palestinian President Yasser Arafat when he was dying and being isolated by the Israelis in the West Bank, and invited him to die as a head of state on French soil. They were prepared to forgive him on everything else. That's what they were rewarded him on. With Hassan Nasrallah, they rewarded him because he defied the U.S. and Israel, fought a war that they thought was an honorable war, that they thought he did well, effectively, better than expected on the battlefield, and they rewarded him for that. And with Hugo Chavez, he was the only ruler in the world the only ruler in the world who cut off diplomatic relations with Israel over the Gaza war in 2009-2010. So what I'm suggesting to you is that foreign policy issues, principally Israel-Palestine and anger with Western policy, was very much on their mind, and certainly that defined even their heroes and their villains, by the way, as well, during that period. Now I'm going to transition to the third thought with which I will end and then open it up for questions. So what does this all mean? Where are we here in the Arab uprisings? What are we witnessing, and where is it going? And I'm going to start by giving you an interpretation of these uprisings. And from that, I will draw some conclusions about why we see this variation in outcomes in the Arab world. The first question that people ask is this set of Arab uprisings that started in 2010 episodic, or is it with us to stay? I mean, if you look at the Arab world, it's not the first time we've had some major uprisings that raised hopes or aspirations and then obviously went back to old ways. So there are people now who fear that now the public is, giving up on them and they're going back to the old days. We see that, in a way, counter-revolutionary forces playing themselves out in several Arab countries. So is this episodic, or is this with us to stay? And I'd like to answer that very quickly by saying, in my own opinion, this is with us to stay. It's not an episodic thing. And let me tell you why. Because at the core of what we're seeing is the empowerment of the individual in the Arab world on a scale that we had never seen before. And that empowerment is enabled by an expanding information revolution that is not going to go backward because it's tied to the economy. You kill it, you can't govern anymore. And so, because it is a function principally of this information revolution that no one can control, that empowerment is only going to expand. It's not going to go backward. And let me give you two flavors of this. I think when you, if you want to really get a sense of how powerful this is, and all of us, of course, understand it at some point because we see what the internet has done to us, even as a democratic country, in terms both as a source of information, but also a source of networking on a scale that we had not seen before, even in a place that had been democratic. I say if you want to understand the impact of the information revolution in the Middle East, you have to compare it in some ways to the Industrial Revolution in the West. Not because it's parallel, obviously different dynamics going on. In the case of the Industrial Revolution, you have earning wages that led to the empowerment of the individual, both in society and in politics. And that transformed Western societies forever. It's still unfolding. And in the Arab world, and in many parts of the world, I think something comparable is happening, where you have the empowerment of the individual through the information revolution, not only because they get information from where they want it, not because somebody else decides it, but also because it's interactive. And that is empowering. When you are a young woman in Saudi Arabia, and even the family is not listening to your opinion, and you tweet something online and you find that you have 5,000 followers, you can imagine how empowering that is. And so I think the empowerment of the public, the empowerment of the individual in the Arab world is with us to stay. That is not going back. Nobody can put the genie back in the bottle. Not the Prime Minister of Turkey, not the military in Egypt. No one can put the genie back in the bottle. It's with us to stay. But here's the thing that I think we didn't understand initially about the ramifications of that public empowerment. Number one, when we say the public is empowered, doesn't mean the public, A, knows what it wants, or B, that it's unified. So when we have empowerment in Egypt, so suddenly we discover that the ultra-conservative Salafis are stronger than we thought. They're suddenly empowered. They were there in the background, and suddenly they're a political force. We had the liberals who are quiet, who suddenly have a voice. Secular and religious, the different sects in Syria. We have the Alawis and the Sunnis and the Druze and the Christians. So everybody gets empowered, and everybody doesn't want necessarily the same thing. And so the more diverse the society is, the more contestation we're going to see, not necessarily the more unity we're going to see. And we see that, in fact, in the way the Arab uprisings are unfolding in terms of diversity of the polity. And that diversity doesn't have to be ethnic. In Egypt, it's really mostly religious, secular in some ways. And not even that is not, it's more political religious versus political secular that we see emerging in Egypt. Number three, the fact that you have public empowerment never means that the public determines politics, not even in our own country. Look at what's happening with our campaign finance laws. To say that Sheldon Adelson and I have the same power is to be, it's a laughable proposition. To say even in terms of voting, because he can mobilize far more votes than I can possibly mobilize. So even in a democracy, the fact is the public will is one aspect of a complex political relationship with bureaucracies, with institutions, with militaries in the Arab world. In fact, in the Arab world, you can't understand the outcome of any of the uprisings without reference to the military institutions that are going to continue to play a role. So now everyone obviously is a factor in politics. So this is the birth of a new politics, not the end of politics. The birth of more complex politics, birth of, in some ways, less predictable politics at a time when you don't have the rules of the game purely defined. Something will stay with us, not just for years, but possibly for decades before it finally settles. But let me end with this, which is, with all the diversity of views and with all the different interests that are going to help shape the outcome country to country, there is one theme that we shouldn't ignore that in the core fueled these uprisings back in 2010. And that is people everywhere in the Arab world who had been deprived of freedom and dignity wanted, first and foremost, an opportunity to raise their heads high, both at home and abroad. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take questions, both about the presentation and about, as I said, other issues that you might have related to American policy in the Middle East.
We have people with microphones, so please feel free to raise your hand.
Hi, thanks for coming to speak with us. Do you look at the internet optimistically or pessimistically in terms of, I guess, politics in the Middle East? When you look at maybe America and the U.S., you can argue it had positive effects, but they also had negative effects. There's misinformation out on the internet. You have people who have similar opinions kind of coalescing together, maybe making them more extreme. So are you optimistic about it or pessimistic?
I think the way I heard the question is, do I look at the internet as optimistically or pessimistically for the Middle East? Let me just start by saying I'm mostly a realist in the way I make an assessment. So I say it's going to have an impact and it's important. It doesn't mean positive or negative. Therefore, I'm not making a value judgment. But overall, in terms of public empowerment for the long haul, which I see as a good, I think I'm optimistic. That's not because I'm unaware of the negative consequences or the short-term struggles that people have to go through. But I'm looking at it from the point of view of 50 years from now, when we look back at this period and make an analysis in the same way that we make an analysis of the Industrial Revolution. We're going to ask this question. I think people are going to be optimistic. People are going to see this as a fueling force, the internet. I want to say one thing about the internet that's really interesting, aside from what we now see, particularly in the social media, the interactive part of it, because you're not only receiving information. With satellite TV, you're principally, receiving information. Not just that, but principally that. With the internet, there's this networking that adds to possibilities, not only for good people, but also for bad people, right? So it provides groups that are destabilizing to also use it. So it could be used both ways. But here's an interesting finding that I haven't fully analyzed it. I'm just in the process of doing it, part of a process. I mentioned to you, how these identities are shifting. Just over the past 5 years, I've been analyzing the identities of people who say that the internet now is their main source of news, as opposed to, say, the television or radio or newspapers, the main source of news. And I could tell you that in that segment of the public, not surprisingly, you got far more people say that their principal identity isn't either Arab, Muslim, or Egyptian, Jordanian, but rather, quote, citizen of the world. So there's a certain type, at the aggregate level. It may help consolidate relations at the sub-level as well, for sure, but right now what we're seeing at the aggregate level, it's expanding the connectedness, undoubtedly. So much so that I defined it as an interactive. When you think about American reaction to the Arab world and Arab reaction to America, we know that when people here in the U.S. saw the initial picture of Tahrir Square in Egypt, it was positive. It even helped transcend the ugliness of 9/11. They're like us. They want freedom. They want democracy. They want their voices heard. We trace that in American public opinion polls. And we see that there's an interactive dimension. So that connectedness in the internet consolidates that kind of reaction. So it can have a positive effect, but of course it can also have a negative effect.
Hi, thank you for coming to speak with us today. My question generally is about your opinion on Western intervention in the situation in Syria right now, and that sort of comes from having heard conflicting opinions on the West intervening in situations like Syria generally. The one is that when situations like that have the potential to very easily become massacres, the West has a duty to intervene. And then on the other side, that Western interference sort of drums up an anti-colonialist sentiment dating back to just generally anti-colonialism in the Middle East.
I have to tell you, the acoustics where I'm standing are so bad that I didn't really hear every word. I know the volume was there, but I didn't hear every word. But is you asking me about the reaction to Western imperialism? Is that or did I misunderstand that?
Yes, just generally whether you think the West should intervene in the situation in Syria, or whether that sort of drums up anti-colonialism.
Okay, now that's a really good question because, and it's something I have been studying, which is, particularly in places like Syria, where obviously it's such a tragedy, and you have, over 100, maybe 100, close to 150,000 people killed. So number one, we look at people outside of Syria in the Arab world. What do they want done, and how do they see the Western world playing a role? And I just want to give you two themes that might help you understand it. Actually, it sharpens. Thanks for the question, because I think it sharpens the issue a little bit more. On the one hand, for example, people in Egypt and Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Morocco, when you ask them, which side do you take in Syria, the regime or the opponents, overwhelmingly they say the opponents. So they don't want Assad, even though in Egypt now it's more mixed than it was 2 years ago. It shifted a little bit. But overall, that's generally the trend. But when you ask them, do you want the the international community or the U.S. to intervene to help the opponents of the regime, they say no. So why? And that gets to it. It's not, they want it done, but they want the U.S. to do it. They don't trust America's intentions. And I've written about this before. I said, even when you intervene in Syria for seemingly humanitarian reasons, even some of those people who want you to do it, the next morning will say you're doing it for imperialistic reasons. Because the mistrust of America and the West is built into many years, tied to broad policies, and at the core level, it's connected to two issues that can't be overcome in the short term. The Israel-Palestine issue, which I call the prism of pain, through which Arabs see the United States particularly, and the presence of American forces in the Gulf. And everything else is going to be interpreted through that prism. There's a whole paradigm, and that's why in a place like Egypt or a place like Syria, the U.S. is being blamed by both sides. In Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood say, we're an agent of the military. We're behind the overthrow of the Brotherhood president. The military says, we're helping the Brotherhood. They're angry with us. They claim. So why? Because that tells you how the easiest way to delegitimize your opponent in the Arab world is to claim a connectedness with American foreign policy. That tells you how much mistrust there is of American foreign policy. Any...
With the advent or the inclusion of the Alaskan pipeline and oil in Canada, are we less likely to interact with the Middle East now that we're more independent based off of our energy?
I know that there is this theory which says that now we're less dependent on Middle Eastern oil, and therefore we can just, leave or detach ourselves. I don't buy that, and let me tell you why. If you look at America's focus on the Middle East strategically, now there are a lot of other reasons we could talk about them, but just connect it to the two themes, oil and Israel, right? Israel, there's a commitment to the U.S. to Israel that obviously defines a certain set of relations that the U.S. will not walk away from shortly. If you look at the oil, a lot of people misunderstood the issue of the oil because the U.S. frankly wasn't importing much from the Middle East anyway in terms of oil. The importance of the Middle East for oil isn't related to what the U.S. directly imports from the region. It is that region still has the largest share of oil reserves in the globe, and that whatever alternative energies we may have in the next 20, 30 years, we're still going to be highly dependent on that region for global economy. So when the oil prices go up in one place, everybody feels it. We're all sipping from the same cup. It doesn't matter whether we're buying it directly from them. If oil becomes scarce there, if they produce more, produce less, the whole global economy is impacted. And when you add to this that much of the need for oil in the coming decades is going to come mostly from Asia, China, India, the new markets, that you're going to see geopolitical competition that is going to be consequential for the way the U.S. defines its interest in the coming years. So it's not likely that the U.S. will just stop thinking this is important. That's number one. But number two, on the Israel issue, we sometimes underestimate how central it is even for the U.S. That is, when people say, well, we can walk away from it. Well, okay, so what does that mean you can walk away? The Israelis are going to come now and ask for 10 more years of military supplies, cutting edge, that Arabs don't have but only Israelis have. Are we going to tell them no? Of course not. But when we tell them yes, we're already involved, right? If we say we're going to walk away from it, does it mean that we're going to let the UN censor Israel over settlement policies in the West Bank? Or are we going to veto? Guess what? We're going to veto. Well, when we veto, we're involved politically. So we pretend like this is going to happen, but in reality, I think our body politic and our strategic interest means that we're tied to the region in ways that we sometimes don't realize.
Thank you, Professor, for a very interesting talk. I wanted to focus on religion and how that plays, I think, not a very significant role, at least in how the United States deals with foreign policy in the Middle East. I think in a liberal democracy like the United States, where we live sort of in an era of religious pluralism, the idea that a Muslim could kill a Christian or a Christian could kill a Muslim is a very foreign idea for us. And I think we have a difficult time understanding that. And that even states in the Middle East that are their very constitutions are based on religious law is a difficult concept for us to understand. And so I guess my question would be, does a country, a liberal democracy like the United States that's marked by secularization and religious pluralism, have the resources to create an effective foreign policy in the Middle East?
Well, first of all, let me answer the first part about the role of religion, because it's an important one, and I think it's sort of misunderstood. I happen to be a liberal individual, where I'm all for the separation of these things. But put that aside, think about it in terms of the makeup. Despite the fact that we have that separation here in the U.S., and we're democratic, and we should be proud of it, and particularly the way it plays itself out at schools, I think when you do polling in the U.S. and look at segments of the public, you'll be surprised how many people rank their religious faith over their citizenship. You'll be surprised. And that is particularly true of certain segments of the evangelical public, which constitutes no less than 1/3 of the American public. But you'll be surprised how that works itself. I do polling among Jewish Israelis, and when I ask them, do you identify yourself first as Israeli or first as Jewish? It used to be roughly half and half. Of the last couple of years, it's been Jewish overtakes citizenship. And now the whole debate, even in the negotiations about the Jewishness of Israel, identifying the Jewishness of Israel, which the U.S. have come to support and even ask for from the Palestinians. So we sometimes don't fully understand how much of a debate there is, even in our own politics on this, that we're. But in terms of foreign policy, when you ask me, do we have the resources to have an effective foreign policy? I say yes. Yes. Because an effective foreign policy doesn't mean military intervention. What bankrupted us over the past decade has been two very badly fought wars. Badly conceived, particularly one, Iraq War. But the Afghanistan War, you can argue, was justified, certainly from a point of view of responding to an attack on American soil. Maybe wasn't carried out properly, but the Iraq War for sure. So I don't think it's a question of resources, because I think actually military interventionism in the Middle East is not the right way to go. And I actually think that despite all the critiques of the Obama administration, which has done many things wrong and many things right, the instinct that don't make the Arab uprisings about America, and don't just be lured by those who say, we need you, come now, and we'll shower you with rice to welcome you when you come in, only to discover what happened in Iraq after Ahmed Jalabi and others saying, come, the Iraqi people love you, and discover that, yeah, they wanted you to get rid of a dictator, but only to then come after you. That's not the way to go. And I think that instinct should guide our foreign policy.
More questions?
There's one here too, but one in the front.
So I'm sure, as you know, Egypt recently sentenced 529 people to death. I was wondering if you could speak to Muslim sentiment of that sentence around the Middle East.
I'm sorry. Say that again. Because
Egypt sentenced 529 people to death. I was wondering if you could speak to public opinion about that ruling in the Middle East.
Did you hear that? Because the acoustics here on the stage are really hard to hear. So. Oh, yes, the sentence. I think it's outrageous, obviously. I think it's something that a lot of Egyptian elites, including ones who actually supported the overthrow of Morsi, are embarrassed by. And it's something that hopefully will not be carried out. But regardless, it's an indication of a really, really broken down Egyptian judicial system. And I think that's something that we have to worry about, because when there is a new election and most likely former defense minister who just resigned to run for president, Sisi, will get elected as president, they're going to need a strong judiciary. And I think that judiciary obviously has so many problems. This is not the first time that we see it. It's going to be one of his biggest challenges. Yeah.
One last question.
My question also has to do with the presidential elections at the end of next month in Egypt. And like you just alluded to, General Sisi is the odds-on favorite to win. And Egyptians have a long history going all the way back to Nasser, electing military leaders to top political positions. With so much that's changed in the region and in that country, why do you think that continues to be the case, that they put so much trust in these military leaders to run the country?
Yeah, in this particular case, of course, the Egyptian military is a central institution in society, but I think that the state was in trouble, and so a lot of people who didn't want to see military rule but didn't want to see the Brotherhood to continue rallied behind the military. And of course, technically, Sisi resigned as defense minister, so the military institution, of course, supporting him, but he's technically running as a civilian. The real question is whether the military can save him if he faces a crisis in a year. And remember what I said earlier. I said that I think this public empowerment is with us to stay. This is one thing that President Morsi, who was overthrown, didn't quite understand. And I remember I had a conversation in the office of the presidency with his top advisor just a few weeks before he was overthrown about the extent to which there is a public and institutional opposition that they have to deal with, that they have to take into account, even beyond getting elected. Is not enough to get elected. One of the Tunisian strongman, sort of spiritual head of the Nahda party, the Islamist party, whose party won the election, came to Washington just a few weeks ago and said, it's enough in a democracy to win an election with 51% of the vote. That's enough. But when you're in a transition and a revolutionary period, that's not enough. You need consensus. And it's because, obviously you don't have the same type of institutions. And I think, Sisi may win by a bigger majority than 51%, but Egypt, the Egyptian public want him to fix Egypt. That's what they want him to do. And if a year's time, there are fewer freedoms in Egypt than there were under Mubarak, and the economy is still in trouble, and people don't have their aspiration, they're going to be out in the streets, and the military will not be able to save them. I think that's what's different about the Middle East today. Thank you very much.